Glad to be here. Like she said, Sean, Steve, and Jana are all at IWU, so therefore you have me. If you don't like the way I speak or something I say tonight, just you don't enjoy it, come back next week. I promise they'll do an even better job. But give it up for the student leaders who led that worship team. Jana left, and they did a fantastic job. So like she said, my name is Brennan. I'm a college student at SDSU. I'm a senior, and I lead the 9th grade Boys Connect group. I've been around GSM for 2 years, and I work with Oasis at the same kind of role Sean works with. So before I jump into it, I wanted to recap a little bit of where we've been. So we're in this series called Sorry Not Sorry, and it's all about forgiveness. In the first week, Sean threw up an Instagram video. So if you guys don't follow GSM's Instagram, you should. But if you don't, he was talking about grudges. And it was a minute-long video about how grudges affect us and how they're negative things in our lives. And then the next week, Sean came last week and was talking to us about how forgiveness from Jesus helps us to forgive others. Now this week, we're going to continue the trend of forgiveness, and it's going to look a little bit different, but we're preaching from the same passage that Sean used last week. So I'm going to have him throw up a couple of verses on the screen, and I'll read it to you so we can kick it off. And it says up there, Matthew 18:21 through 22. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, "Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times?" Jesus answered, "I tell you, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. And before we really dive into what that's all talking about, I want to take a look back at what Matthew 18 is talking about. So Jesus is talking to this group of people, and he's giving them kind of these series of lectures. And each lecture has a different topic. And he starts off the first one talking about children. And he's explaining to these people why children are so important to God. And he uses that as a metaphor of how God loves us as his children. Then he talks about causing others to stumble. What that means is if you have a friend and you're hurting their relationship with God, he looks at the consequences of what that looks like for you. Then he talks even more about sheep. So if you're a high schooler, I promise every week I do not talk about sheep, but it did come up again. So he talks about sheep, and it's the same kind of story where he loses one and then he finds it and rejoices in losing and finding the sheep. Then the last one he talks about is dealing with sin of other people. So this is a really tough one, because I know we all have friends who maybe aren't living the way they're supposed to, the way God tells us to live, and that's a really hard avenue to walk through. And when Jesus is teaching us these things, and then he finishes it with forgiveness, he's kind of walking us through steps on how we can live life. And this is a common thing for us. So Jesus finishes Matthew 18 talking about forgiveness, and it's those verses he just read. And this is important because he finishes it on that high note. He finishes it with something he thinks is so important. He knew how important forgiveness was, but he knew it didn't make that easy. So I'm going to tell you guys a quick story. It's a story about my life. And back when I was in high school, I was a sophomore, and as you can see, I'm a soccer fan. This is a soccer jersey. I know it looks funky. Yeah, soccer. But I was a sophomore, and it was ending towards the end of the season, end of the school year. So it was like semester test time. And I played for Dakota Alliance, which is a program out of Sioux Falls. And we used to play this team called South Dakota United, which was out of Pierre, and they had other students, or kids from the state, and they were like our arch rival. So it was the day before my biggest AP exam, which is like a big test you might have to take in high school, and I was playing this friendly soccer game. And a friendly just means that it wasn't worth anything, nobody was winning a trophy, you just played for competitive fun. But anytime you guys play an arch rival, I'm sure you know this, there's really not too much competitive fun in it. It's really aggressive, it's really high-paced. So we were playing this soccer game, and we were all just going like top-notch hard. And we were up a goal, and I went and did a slide. So if you know in soccer, you can do a slide tackle, and my ankle kind of folded a wrong way. And it would have been fine, I probably would have just rolled it, but the guy actually fell on top of me after I did that. And when that happened, there was like this nice crunching noise, where it was, that was kind of how I felt too. A little bit of cringe, like, that wasn't good. So, of course, I'm so tough. I'm not crying at all. No tears. And I see my dad, he hears the screams, and he sprints down the sideline, off the parents' bench, and he jumps in our minivan. And last week, Sean was talking about dad driving minivans, and like, my dad was cool, and he drove a minivan. So that's what's up. But he pulls the minivan onto the soccer field. He's like drifting around lawn chairs, like whipping it onto this grass field. And he pulls up, and my teammates pick me up and kind of like shuck me into the back seat. Because if you know anything, ambulances are just like ridiculously expensive. So my dad's like, no, it's fine, I'll drive it. So we start cruising to the emergency room. We get there, and he unloads me, and like I'm in this wheelchair. They wheel me in. We're doing X-rays. We're checking everything, making sure I'm like alive. And it comes back that I had broken. Shocker, right? We all heard the crunch. The parents heard the crunch on the sideline. So it's no shocker that it broke. But a little piece of me deep down was wishing it hadn't. And I tell this story because I got hurt in a second. One moment I was fine, and the next moment I wasn't. And when that doctor gave me the news that I had a broken ankle, it started a 3-month recovery process to where I was able to finally walk normal again at the end. And the reason I say this is because hurt happens in a moment, but healing happens through a process. And it's the same thing with our emotions, same thing with forgiveness. And we want everything so fast. Think about it. Instant oatmeal. Microwave mac and cheese because we don't want to boil water anymore. High-speed Wi-Fi, because I know half of you in the crowd, when you pull up Instagram and that video takes more than half a second to load, you're just going to skip it and jump to the next video because that's what I do. And we want it so fast nowadays. And the same thing applies to forgiveness. So like I said, we talked about grudges. We talked about how Jesus forgiving us helps us forgive others. And now we're talking about forgiveness again. And the thing is, most of us have tried forgiveness. Think about it. You've tried it, and sometimes it just straight up doesn't work. Like you have a brother or a sister who's done something to you, and still every time that comes up, you feel hurt. You have a dad or a stepdad who said something to you, and every time you see them, it just rubs you the wrong way. You have a relationship that didn't end well, whether it was a boyfriend, girlfriend, or friend, and now you can't even be in the same room as that person. So why doesn't it work? We've all been there when we say, I tried. We've also all been there when we say, I can't. What that person did, no, I can't forgive that. And when it comes to forgiveness, we want to feel better now. And that's true if you're forgiving. Think about it. If you're forgiving someone, you don't want to feel sad anymore. You don't want to feel hurt and mad. You just want it to go away. But that's also true if you're the one asking for forgiveness. You want that relationship where you might have accidentally hurt that person, or maybe deliberately. You want it to go back to normal, where you can be friends again, where you can get along again. So why doesn't it work? You're trying. Well, there's this truth in Matthew that we're going to look at. So if you'll throw that back up on the screen, we'll read it one more time. And it says in Matthew 18, 21 through 22, Then Jesus came to Peter and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? Jesus answered, I tell you not 7 times, but 70 times 7. Before we even look at the words, I want to look at the story as a whole. Matthew tells a story of Peter that's brutally honest. Think about it. Peter does not look good after this finishes. He just came up confident to Jesus, and he's like, 7. And Jesus is like, no. And then Matthew tells the story, and they're like co-workers, like comrades. They're working together to try to learn about Jesus so that one day they can spread the good news about Jesus. So Matthew, including a story that makes Peter look bad, makes his story look bad. It hurts his case that Jesus is the Messiah. So that's one of the reasons I think this is so important, because it has to be true. He wouldn't tell it if it was false. Let me give you another example. Let's say I'm a fan of creamy peanut butter, and I'm arguing with someone who's delusional and thinks crunchy peanut butter is better. So let's just give them names, just throw hypotheticals in the air. Creamy peanut butter Brennan, and crunchy peanut butter Allie. My fiance Allie, and we're having this conversation, and I'm like, you know, creamy peanut butter is the best. And she's over here like, no, crunchy peanut butter is the best. And I'm like, I don't know. And then she goes, I promise it's the best. And then I say, you know, right, I'm wrong a lot of the time. You know, I wouldn't trust me. Now what's that do to my case? Yeah, nobody's going to argue for creamy peanut butter if you say you're wrong all the time. And that's kind of what Matthew's doing. He's showing Peter in a bad light. So when we talked about last week, and we looked at what Sean was saying, we looked that Peter is kind of this spokesman of the group. So they have this group, this 12 disciple group, and I could just picture them. They're all over there thinking of this question about forgiveness. And they're all like, I ain't asking. No. I'm not asking this question. And then Peter steps up, he's like, me and Jesus, we're bros. Like, I'll ask the question, like I got this. So he walks up and he says, all right, 7 times. And Jesus is like, because Peter walks up to the plate and he's like, Jewish custom is to forgive 3 times. They hurt you 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, you forgive them 4th time, they might end up in jail, they might get a fine, they might get something even worse. So Jesus is Peter's stepping up, and he's lofting the ball high. He thinks he just gave Jesus a softball to hit out. But Jesus comes back and tells him he's wrong. But when we read it, we got to make sure we read Jesus' tone correctly. Because he's not responding in some overly sophisticated voice saying, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. He doesn't do that. And he doesn't do it sassy either. Jesus isn't like, Peter, come on. Like, it's not 7. It's 70 times 7. And we got to remember, Jesus is loving Peter. And he says, hey, Peter, like, good try, but it's actually 70 times 7. And I think this gives us an example of how to disagree well. So it's a little bit of a tangent off the message, but look at how Jesus combats what Peter said was wrong. He does it with love. But yet the fact is still jaw-dropping. It is. You would have pictured all the disciples, and when Jesus said this, they all just would have jaw-dropped when he said that 490 times is the amount of forgiveness. Everybody walking by would have hit like one of these, like a crazy jaw-drop. And this is way more than Peter 7, but it's way more than the Jewish 3. But Jesus doesn't actually mean 490. He doesn't want us to pull out our tally sheet, and every time your sister or brother does something wrong, you're like, 489, and then you hit 490 and you're like, yes, I never have to forgive him again. It's just not how it works. We don't have a tally sheet. Jesus is saying the opposite. He's saying there is no limit to forgiveness. When we make it a number, we remove the aspect that it has to heal our heart. You need to forgive as many times as it takes for the forgiveness to take. Let me say that one other way. You need to forgive as many times as it takes for your words to match what your heart is feeling. And when we really dive into what that's saying, it's saying it's going to take time. Sometimes it's 3 forgivings. Maybe it's 77. Maybe it is 490. But forgiveness almost always takes time. And you know why? It's because you're hurt. And your hurt needs healing. And healing takes time. There's no quick fix to healing. I wish I could put your hurt in a bowl, throw it in the microwave, and zap it for 30 seconds and pull it out a nice toasty pot of healed. But you can't do that. And think about it. If you've hurt someone and they're taking time to process that, to try to walk through that, to forgive you, give them a break. It's going to take a second. But the opposite is again true. If you've been hurt, if you're not okay with it the second that conversation ends, give yourself a break. You need to keep forgiving until your emotions catch up with your words. And there's good news in that. It means it's okay to not be okay. I'll say it again. It is okay to not be okay. And that's a crazy thing for a lot of us to hear a lot of times, because we always feel like we need to put a smile on and everything needs to be perfect. But if you're hurt, it's okay to not be okay. You just need to grieve in an appropriate way. But there's not good stuff in that too, that it takes time. Because like you guys, probably like me, I still want the quick fix. I think it'd be easier, don't you, if you could just press a button and make all the hurt go away. But Jesus never gave us a checklist because he didn't want us to have it. He wants us to have heart healing. He wants us to be emotionally and mentally healthy. He wants us to have strong relationships with our friends and our families built on forgiveness. And that takes practice, that takes time. So let's go back to my ankle injury. I got that news that I wasn't going to play soccer, hardly even walk for the next 3 months. And And I wanted the quick fix. I wanted them to pull out like their caulk gun full of bone glue and just like glue it up and I'd walk out of the hospital. But that's not what it was meant to be. It wasn't meant to be a quick fix. The better fix was the long wait, where my bone healed back together stronger than it was before. And throughout that 3 months, I had rehab and I had lots of checkups. And sometimes when I came into those checkups, the doctor gave me good news. Hey, you're off your crutches a week early. Or maybe it was not so good news, and he was like, hey, you gotta be in your boot for another couple days. And that's the same thing with forgiveness. Sometimes when you check that, sometimes it's gonna be moving faster, and sometimes it's not, because everybody's different. Every single hurt is different. But time always plays a part of the solution. And there's hope in that. There's a way forward. Knowing what the conclusion looks like helps you to get there. Earlier today, I was having some supper, and Allie made it for me while I was practicing this. She's so kind. And I knew supper was happening in 20 minutes. And because I knew supper was happening in 20 minutes, I didn't have to go grab the bag of chips. I could wait because it made it easier knowing that there was a process. So I asked you, what's your 490? Where's your hurt? What's going to take 490 times to move past, it feels like? What actions, what people, what scenarios, what words? Because over the last 3 weeks, as we talked about forgiveness, chances are you've thought of something. You've thought of a person or an action, and it's okay if you're not there yet. It is. If you haven't forgiven them yet, if you're working on it still, that's what matters. Keep making it a priority. It always is going to take some time. If you're like me, I really like things super practical. I want a checklist. I like it like having a planner and being able to scratch off my to-do list. So I'm going to actually give you 3 steps on what I think are helping ways to forgive people. They're not complicated, but that doesn't mean they're not challenging. So step 1 is you got to pray for that person. Pray that they do well in school, they do well in sports, they have good relationships. And I know that sounds crazy. It does. But it's going to change the way your heart feels about them. The second one is even crazier. You got to serve them. And I'm not talking tennis, I'm not talking ping pong. Continue to pray for them. Help them with their schoolwork, help them with their sports. Help them with an issue they're going through. And this is really going to help the way you think about them. And the third one is just downright the craziest of them all. Repeat it. Over and 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 over again. Pray and serve and pray and serve and pray and serve and pray and serve until it catches. Because that's how you heal. It's not bitterness. It's not anger. It's definitely not forgetting it and hoping it goes away. And I'm not telling you up here, I'm not up here telling you this is going to be easy. It won't be easy. It'll be difficult. But it'll also be worth it. Let's think about it a different way. What if you hurt someone? What would you want them to do? Because if I hurt someone, I'd want them praying for me, helping me out, and trying to bridge that relationship. Because ultimately, forgiveness is about you. It's about being set free to who God's called you to be, breaking the chains and the bondage of that hurt. So earlier I said something that I kind of slid it in there. And I said forgiveness almost always takes time. And there's one example where if it didn't exist, I would have said always. But that example is salvation. Because Jesus, the Son of God, came to earth and lived for 33 years. And during his last 3 years of life, he did ministry. And he did a lot of amazing stuff. He healed the blind, he made the lame walk. But the greatest thing he ever did that far surpassed any of the other ones is he went to the cross for each and every one of us. And while they were pinning him to the cross, he forgave them. And he said, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. And then he died. And he was in the tomb for 3 days. And when he rose, he came and he was preaching a news that's good news about forgiveness, about grace, about truth. And when you accept that message, that forgiveness comes like a wave. That forgiveness doesn't take any time. Your sins past, present, and future are gone. Completely washed away as far as the east is from the west, they're gone. And that forgiveness happens in a snap. So if you've never accepted that forgiveness which Jesus is freely offering to you, tonight is your night. Please, I'm asking you, tonight is your night if that forgiveness has never been accepted by you, because Jesus is begging you to take what he's already done. And when you go to your Connect groups shortly after this, I'm going to ask you to tell your Connect group leader. Because Paul writes about when you make a decision like that, you're now a new creation. And that new creation has a new responsibility. And that life won't be easy to walk through as well. But with the Connect group and your GSM family, it'll be a whole heck of a lot easier. So as we dismiss for Connect groups, think about forgiveness in your relationships. What's holding you back? What would it take to even start to forgive someone? What would it look like to move in a way that God's called you to move? What would it take to move towards healing? Because God's asking you to be healthy and whole, not bitter and hurt. Make the decision today for true forgiveness. Let's pray. Dear Father, I just thank you for the opportunity tonight to speak to these students, just to lift them up, to teach them on a hard topic, God, because we all know, even you, that forgiveness is not easy. It is something that is deep inside of us that's been hurt, and to move forward with that healing is not easy. So I'm asking you tonight, God, to help us with that move. So over the last 3 weeks that we've continued to learn about forgiveness, as people have continued to pop up in our minds, in our hearts, as that action we just think is so far unworthy of forgiveness, I pray we move towards that, God, as we continue to forgive. Jesus, work in our hearts to move towards forgiveness. We love you, Jesus. We thank you for everything you're doing in our lives. And we pray this all in your holy